Hello, I hope you're having a really good week. My name is Hilary Seabrook and welcome to my podcast, Harmonious World. This podcast is all about me interviewing people who are doing interesting things in music, and this week is no exception. I'm delighted to be joined by Muneer Nasser, who is the son of the late great bassist Muneer Nasser. What you're listening to now is Muneer's version of Cherokee with his quintet featuring Elijah Easton on sax, Aline Johnson on piano, James King Jr. on bass and John Lamkin III on drums. And the reason I'm talking to Muneer is because he's got a new album out, which is called A Soldier's Story. And A Soldier's Story is the musical companion of Muneer's book, Upright Bass, The Musical Life and Legacy of Muneer Nasser. The book is a musical tribute to Muneer Nasser, who is a bassist that I had actually never heard of. But he played with everybody. The foreword to Upright Bass is written by phenomenal, legendary bassist Ron Carter, who talks about Muneer Nasser's incredible talent, describes him as a must-hear bassist, an entrepreneur, long-time partner in the Ahmad Jamal trio. And he finishes with, if you called him using one of these names, he would turn, greet you with a great big smile and a serious handshake. As for me, I called him my friend. And I'm going to be reviewing the book for The Riff magazine, for which I'm associate editor. So I hope you enjoy listening to my conversation with Muneer Nasser as we talk about his own music, but also the music of his father, Muneer Nasser.
Hello.
Welcome to Harmonious World. It's a real honour to interview you.
Thank you, Hilary. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes.
I always like to share information. So I'm 55. I'm from what they call Generation X, and the X is the unknown.
Yeah.
So we're trying to make what we learn, because we're a bridge between the old and new.
Right.
My generation, we remember no computers, no phones. And so we're in both worlds. We have feet in each of the different worlds,
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean I'm the same. I'm a little bit older than you, but we grew up when you had a television, but it only had a few channels, and you watched it together as a family. We had a landline telephone,
right.
No computers or anything like that. So
wow,
yeah,
it's going to be interesting to see the difference when the studies are done about how that affected each generation.
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
one was more beneficial?
Yeah,
because it seemed like a lot more great people came out of that old environment where there were less distractions than this new environment that we're in.
Yeah,
where there's so many 500. You talk about 3 channels. I remember that. Now there's like 500 or 600.
Yeah,
Can you imagine?
Yeah. Crazy, isn't it?
Crazy, yes.
Right. So tell me about your book and the music about your dad. So you're Muneer Nasser and your dad is
Muneer Nasser.
Muneer Nasser. Yeah. Right.
But he originally was George Joyner. He changed his name in the 50s.
Oh, really?
That's detailed in the book. So his story is, if you start from there, that's different from Ron Carter. That's different from Wilbur Ware, of any other bass player you could name, because he was one of the pioneers that actually changed his identity. Because as African Americans, they took our names. That's very important point of our history.
Absolutely.
That we came from Africa with identity. It was stripped from us. And a few people at that time were willing to reclaim that identity that was stolen. And that came with consequences, because basically they branded the slaves with their name. And some of us continue to hold on to that brand. And it's hard to respect that when you're supposed to be free, but you're still carrying the brand of your former owner.
Yeah.
And so he gave that name back and became Jamil Nasser. And he said half of his work went out the window in 19. That's in New York, in
Wow.
1957, 58. He said half his work went out the window just on that decision. So that's a
Wow.
point of separation um, between him and other musicians that came along at the time he did.
Right. That's a fascinating. So how old was he when he took that decision?
That he was about 25.
Right.
Yeah, so young and coming to New York, that was controversial because there was a little friction between the Jews and the Muslims then.
Right.
And so that was pointed out. I put that in a book. Dizzy Gillespie spoke about that. That's before my father. That's in the 40s.
Right.
That's before he even came to New York. And so the person that talked to him about Islam, Idris Suleiman, great trumpet player that a lot of people are not familiar with that name, but he was a great composer and an alto saxophonist par excellence. That's Idris Suleiman. He moved to Denmark in the early 60s.
Right.
But he's one of the first pioneers of bebop. Mary Lou Williams said he could hear Monk's music before Miles or Kenny Dorham or any of those cats. That's why he's on the first album, because he could hear that harmony. The other trumpet players were struggling with it. So he's an important person too. And he changed his name in the 40s. But that's where my history starts too, because I come into that. He had already changed his name. I'm born June 3rd, 1967 in New York City. So I come in this name, second generation. And even in the 70s, there was all kinds of, because now you're African American, but you're in a different group. So that's a double minority because you experience some alienation from your own African American people and teasing and mockery. See, because you don't
Wow.
eat pork, you don't go to church, and these are big points of separation.
Yeah.
People that haven't experienced that, it would be hard to explain, but it's a big point of alienation and separation. That you have to go through, and so that made me curious. That made me I had to be able to defend what I believed and who I was at a very young age, which necessitated research.
Okay.
So from early on, I was teaching and giving out whatever little information I had. And then my father was taking us out early, as early as 1974, because he was playing with Ahmed Jamal. I was going to the clubs. He was taking us to the concerts, more so concerts than clubs. And then eventually I went to the Village Gate. I saw Dizzy Gillespie. So I was around this music. I was around the musicians. And it was a powerful exposure, man. When you're a kid and you're exposed to something like that, I mean, you don't have too many choices about what you want to be. It's like the choice has been made when you're in
Yeah.
an environment like that. And you see the joy and the power of the music and the people, and you feel that. And you feel the power of that. It's life changing, especially that early.
Yeah.
And I started playing about 1976 after seeing Dizzy Gillespie, and I've been playing ever since. I never even thought about stopping, you know.
No.
And so jazz is a powerful music, and it's had that kind of um, role in my life. And I got brothers that played. My brother Umar, he played bass. He used to play. Zayd is a master alto saxophonist. He continues to play.
Right.
And I have others and brothers and sisters, but they're not involved in music.
Okay.
And so maybe I'll discuss them another time. But for purpose of our discussion, I had an older brother Umar. He played bass and viola, and then Zayd continues to play.
Right.
So we're
O-
continuing that musical legacy and tradition.
Okay. And is that why you felt drawn to write the book and then the music around your father was to acknowledge and pay tribute to your history?
Now, Hillary, that's a good question. And I'm glad you asked it because when my father died after playing with Coltrane, Ahmed
Oh,
Jamal for 10 years, anybody you could name, Monk for a week. Most books leave that out. I captured it, but my father worked with Thelonious Monk in 1972, May of 1972, for 6 days at the Aqua Lounge in Philly. And Monk said, this cat didn't even ask me nothing about my music. Most people, even Coltrane, asked Monk and Johnny Griffin, and they had to do research, and he was able to hear what Monk was playing. Um, but we noticed he didn't appear in Downbeat a lot. We knew he could play. We knew he was I could hear that with my ears that he
yeah.
was worthy of the coverage, as was his colleagues like George Coleman, Harold Maper. And we listened to these guys say, well, how come they're not in the jazz time and downbeat? How come when I read books, I don't see their names? See? And
Yeah.
so we knew when he passed that he wasn't going to be covered. So we knew we had to do this research um, and put the information out. And he's a storyteller. Anybody that knew my father, if you met him and you sat down with him, you were going to get a story about jazz, you know? So he was a historian, a teacher. He went on radio, he went on television. It would have been a big surprise if he didn't leave a memoir or any kind of record of his experiences and information behind. So this is a preemptive strike. He died. Getting to my point, Jazz Times didn't cover it. They've covered roadies that clean the buses and set
Yeah.
up instruments for Miles Davis that died in their 40s from a drug overdose. They got time in Jazz Times or somebody else, but for some reason, Jazz Times and Downbeat didn't feel like Jamil Nasser was significant enough to note his passing. You see?
Yeah.
Um, Nor did they review the book. I just sent one to Downbeat. We'll see what they're going to do. But I sent them a book. Jazz Times didn't review the book. Why? That's the question.
Yeah.
And it's an irrelevant question now because I did the book. So, I
Right.
mean, it'd have been nice for the exposure, but I see I'm not dependent on them to keep his legacy alive. This man sent Lester Young home from Paris to die. Okay?
Wow.
To die. And they didn't want to give Lester his money. They wanted him to wait. They had to almost fight the people physically to get his money to come home and die.
Wow.
And when you see books, when you read other books on Lester Young, you're not going to find that. You can only find that out in this book. What
Right.
happened with Phineas Newborn? This was a pianist that captured the imagination of Ray Charles, of Oscar Peterson, of Quincy Jones, anybody that ever heard him, right? His story is being told for the first time in print in this book. My father gave interviews on it in New York, but if you weren't listening to the interview and taking copious notes, you still wouldn't know. And it's too many details to be transmitted orally.
Yeah.
Some of our history must be written and documented before so you can understand it. Just like Oscar Denied, they went to North Africa in the late 50s, early 60s. He was a formidable pianist, another one that worked with Lionel Hampton. And so a lot of people don't know about him. But if you ask Johnny Griffin when he was alive, I met him. He said, man, your father ever teach you about Oscar Denied? This man was a genius. Quincy Jones talked about him. All those guys knew. But when the history was written, he was left out. And there's so many like that.
Yeah.
And so this book will tell you the story of Oscar Denied. You Google his name. I challenge you. You might get a paragraph, but we have his whole story pretty much, or part of his story, not his whole story, but most a nice portion of it, you know, more than you'll get anywhere else. Let me put it that way in
Wow.
this book.
And there's a great photo of your dad with the bass on the front.
Yes.
It's a lovely
Yes.
photo.
Yes,
That's
thank you. Thank you so much. I wanted it to be colorful because a lot of the jazz books are like have that gloomy,
Yeah.
dark look, smoky, and it looks like something from the past.
Yeah.
Like he could walk off that cover and do a gig today. You see what I'm saying? And
Yeah.
that shirt would be valid to wear today. And that's I wanted to capture some modernity to say jazz goes on, it moves on. It didn't stop back in the 50s. And
Right.
so, and a lot of the period from 76 on through, it's not covered because they cover historical musicians like Count Basie, well, Count Basie lived through the early 80s, but Billie Holiday and Lee Morgan, people they're doing a document, their lifespan didn't extend into the 80s and into the late 70s. And that was a golden period of jazz too, that's under documented. And so we captured some of that as well in this book.
So it's called Upright Bass. It's the musical life and legacy of Jamil Nasser.
Yes.
Where can people get hold of a copy?
You can go on our website, which is jamilsnasser.com, or you can order it on Amazon.
Okay.
I prefer website orders, but for overseas, probably Amazon would be a more efficient way of ordering this book.
Right. Okay. But I have lots of listeners in the States. In fact, I think about half my listeners are in the States. So they need to go to your website. So that's fine. So I'll put that link into the show notes so people can just click on it. So then talk to me about the music. So the book is called Upright Bass, but the album is called A Soldier's Story. Why is it called A Soldier's Story?
Well, the book answers that. because I mean, we had to struggle as a family too, because in those times my father kind of talked about some of the injustices in the business, and there were many, and they continue now. And people are not discussing the pension fund, the jazz emergency fund. A lot of these guys, after they finished having a great career and made the records that we love and enjoy to this day, they didn't have health care. They didn't have dental care. They would die without burial insurance. They had to take up collections to bury a lot of cats. So the Jazz Emergency Fund is something that goes on to this day. And Jazz Injustice, because a lot of clubs won't pay into the pension fund. So when musicians retire, they'll have a nest egg. There's
Yeah.
a way that they could do that. So every time you play and everywhere you play, they take a small portion of the earnings and they put it in a pension fund. So this is not just a celebration of Jamil Nasser. This is a historical analysis, because we need to analyze history, not just celebrate. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done now. You see what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
This is not about celebrating no dead jazz musicians. And that's what Jazz Foundation was originally designed to do that. They wanted to memorialize dead jazz musicians. My father and Jimmy Owens said, no, let's make this organization about preserving the living artists, not celebrating the dead ones. And so even about heroin and its role in the business, in the demise of many musicians, this is something that's not discussed that often. In this book, it is, and it needs to be discussed because there's lessons that need to be learned, And so you can celebrate history, which you could go and cherry pick for all the feel good stuff.
Yeah.
Who was the best player and what's your favorite album is. Or you could analyze history and say, okay, those are good things, but how many of them own their music? How many of them own their publishing? How many of their families are getting the proceeds from their work? See? Then the conversation takes a different turn. It's not as pleasant. So we have to analyze history because in that analysis, we find there's still work to be done.
Yeah.
Like the fact that Freddie Hubbard died in 2008, a genius of the trumpet, a genius as a composer, and there's not even a faint rumbling about a book on Freddie Hubbard.
Yeah.
So what hope does anybody have coming down from that level? Even Ron Carter's book, Guinness Book of World Records, most recorded basis, he had to self-publish his book, though.
Right.
How come an American publisher did not come to the most recorded jazz basis and say, hey, we want to know your story, and give them a nice advance and have it so that book is distributed throughout the United States? This is Ron Carter. So it goes down from there, and they don't get covers of books or albums because they're seen as background. And when you look at the jazz books, it's Count Basie, it's Billie Holiday, it's Miles Davis, it's Coltrane. It's about who's up front. But these guys saw a lot too, and they learned a lot, and they take their stories to the grave with them.
Yeah. And those greats, those names that you mentioned, wouldn't have been the way they were without the bass players, the drummers, sitting behind them doing the stuff that needed to be done. And I'm not talking about people like Buddy Rich. I'm talking about the side men.
Right.
Yeah.
And see, that's another kind of thing we have to investigate because it's like I think we get into personality worship.
Yeah.
We got to look at that and its limitations, because then it becomes about the person out front and then the supporting cast, because they're not on the side. Because when I look at a jazz band, the bass is usually behind the person in the front. But we know from a sonic standpoint and from a cultural aesthetic standpoint, everybody's contributing. But when it comes to the business, it's about the leader and who's out front, and they get the lion's share of the money.
Yeah.
And then the side men and the side women get sidelined. They get side wages. Absolutely. You know what I'm saying? And they get pushed to the side. And when it comes to historical references, for instance, there's a Downbeat article out now on 3 albums that Ahmad Jamal did. And my father's on 3 of the CDs, but he's not mentioned in the album. I mean, in the article. How does that happen?
Yeah.
He's on 3 CDs. I'm talking about the Downbeat that's out today. How does that happen that, you're talking about an album, he's on 3 CDs, and they have an album, an article, here I can say album again, and his name is not mentioned. Now, that could be an editorial problem. Oh, we just forgot. but I've seen it too many times, and I'm not mad about it. I'm just like, that's why we did the book. I'm glad we
Right.
did the book. So I probably would be mad about it if I didn't do the book.
Yeah.
But because I covered it in there and did the preemptive strike, I could just say it's an observation. Let's put it, it's an interesting observation. And it also confirms the reason why we did this book. We knew they were going to do that.
Right.
But we didn't know some of the close people were going to do that. We knew some of the people that were, you know, just enemies of justice for the musicians and equity for the musicians. They would have a problem
Yeah.
with it. Because there was a lot of exploitation, musicians that work for like starvation wages. I mean, it's a sad story and it's not told. Everybody wants to feel good. So a soldier story, getting back to that, is the struggles these guys went through, the struggles we went through. So I put that in music. I wanted to commemorate that in music. So the CD is the musical companion of the book.
Right.
And anybody that committed themselves to this art, but in my father's case, it just wasn't about playing. He kind of put himself out there beyond just playing. You know what I'm saying? And he took a
Okay.
leadership position. He took a lot of controversial positions that rubbed people the wrong way, and it cost him work.
Right.
You know what I'm
And that's
saying?
probably why this legacy of kind of ignoring him is because difficult people,
Mm-hmm.
it's easier to just like, let's just whitewash over them. And actually, whitewash is the right word, isn't it? It's like difficult women. Nina Simone, it was her birthday yesterday, I think.
Wow.
She was difficult. Some of the interviews that you hear are amazing where she,
Yes.
but she's not difficult. She's just opinionated. Well, I'm sorry if that offends you. A woman has
Right.
an opinion, but
Yes.
get over yourself.
Exactly.
But
And that same women is drawing them in there, standing room only.
yeah, yeah,
That shows that she has a right to have some kind of opinion. She's certainly putting her power and force in the world,
absolutely.
and
Yeah,
earning her right to speak and
yeah,
express herself. If we tolerate it in a musical context, why can't that be done off stage? Why can't she have the
absolutely.
same latitude to express herself off stage as she has on? You
Exactly.
love it on stage, but when she takes that off stage, that
Yeah.
same power that you see on stage, then it becomes a problem.
Yeah. And that's what that it sounds like that's the issue with your father, that he was, that people were happy when he was standing at the back playing his bass, and that was great. And he
Right.
would be recorded and he could be, appear on stage and all the rest of it. But as soon as he came off stage and started, talking about stuff, then it becomes more uncomfortable and people kind of ignore it. And then it's easier to push him to the side.
And you know what really in kind of fairly modern times would demonstrate that? The Dixie Chicks, Shut Up and Sing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everybody, they were loved and adored until they took that anti-war position, and more than half of their fan base, man,
Yeah. Yeah.
just dropped off. I mean,
Yeah.
overnight. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? The
Yeah.
same people that loved them yesterday hated them today when they
Yeah.
took a controversial stand on that war, or what was
Yeah.
considered to be So that's how the music business is constructed. You have to go along to get along. And
Yeah.
if you open your mouth too much, you will not work. That's the consequence. So you have to be prepared for it. But how do you prepare for that?
Yeah.
For being without, and you know what I'm saying,
Yeah.
struggling to pay bills, that's
Yeah.
still gonna really be vexatious to your spirit.
Yeah. Sure.
And what in his case though, he was on his own. Even people he worked with was like, you know what I mean? If the
Yeah.
promoter, there's times that the promoter just said, "Hey, don't y'all can have the gig, but he can't."
Right.
And I've heard that from musicians. So that's a part of the soldier element, to soldier through and do what's right, even if it makes you uncomfortable
Yeah.
and you have to brave the consequences, which sometimes is less work and less exposure.
Yeah.
It's the system rewards you when you shut your mouth and let them just have their way.
Yeah.
And he wasn't willing to do that. So
So, and
that's why
you're,
we kind of understand, but it's still nevertheless frustrating. We talk about the information age, and still, and we vacillate between saying the gatekeepers are gone and now we could publish, and you can, but it cost me $13,000 to produce that book. That wasn't free
yeah.
press.
Yeah.
Where? That cost 13,000, and maybe this is the reason. And then most publishers say jazz books don't sell. Like I hear people talk about Notes and Tones. I just went to a panel discussion. Everybody's like, Notes and Tones by Artell's a classic book. Oh, okay. It came out in 77, right? Do
Yeah.
you know that he went to major New York publishers and they turned him down. He had to self-publish. He had interviews with Monk, with Miles when he wasn't giving interviews.
Yeah.
They did not care.
No.
They said, we're not interested. And I'm saying in New York. I didn't say in North Carolina. So
No.
this is stuff that kind of goes on that people, and really, if you're really honest, they never really push nothing jazz. The music, the books, nothing. Not even
No.
the publishers.
No.
You know, because a lot of times they're not, like you take a university publisher, they're not trying to sell a book. They don't have to sell a book. So they could not do an index. As I've seen some of the books, they have a name concordance, no index. So it's not integrated with the digital pool of information.
Yeah.
So they take liberties. But in a trade publisher, man, I mean, you're going to have an index and all the other elements necessary to make it marketable. I think the university presses, and I'm going to go ahead and say it publicly, they cut corners on these kind of things, particularly the index. I have a couple of books here. I'm not going to name them, by top musicians. They come out of university presses. They don't even have an index.
Yeah.
So that's not good.
No. Well,
and so that's what we have going on. So this is just one effort. I mean, we got the music. I mean, think of it. African Americans too, they play the music, but we got to start writing, man. That's not enough.
Absolutely.
It's not enough.
And it needs erudite people like you who can stand up and go, well, write the book, but then talk about the book and talk about the background and talk about it. Because I had no idea about your father, and I should have done. I know quite a lot about jazz, and I should have done. I should have heard his name before, and his name was not unfamiliar to me, but it wasn't somebody that I knew about.
Right.
But now I do. So that's good. So
it's like you cannot, if you listen to John Coltrane, you cannot overlook his name. He's on like 7 of his most important albums.
Wow.
And in fact, I'm meeting with Mr. Fuji, who was on the John Coltrane documentary. And he came to my father's memorial. He said, look, man, your father's on one of the only albums where Coltrane plays straight ahead alto. You know what I'm saying? And it's clear. Yeah. It don't sound like it's coming through, fried chicken frying in the background. It's a clear recording. And he said that's one of the most important albums in John Coltrane's discography. There's only 2 of them. And one of them they found a couple of years ago in Japan. But that's out. He's playing more out on that. I'm talking about straight ahead, alto, saxophone.
Yeah.
And then B.B. King's first band. Not the B.B. King we came to know. No. The B.B. King that was just getting started on Beale Street. And then up from that to a movie with Whitney Houston and Denzel Washington, The Preacher's Wife. They have a scene in that. And that's just a couple of things, over time. In England, especially, he worked there with Al Haig. He recorded Expressly Ellington. We have a book in the Sussex Library because Art Thiemann lives there. Art Thiemann was a saxophonist on this album, Expressly Ellington, recorded in 1978. My father's played at Ronnie Scott's with Monty Alexander on a few occasions.
Oh, wow.
And so he has with Al Haig, there's bootlegs of him playing with Al Haig just around in London. And so he has a history there too. And the bass he played, that's where he found it. I put all of that in the book.
Right.
He was there when the Brixton riots happened in 1981. They were
really?
there in April of 1981. They were playing at Ronnie Scott's.
Wow.
And so just stuff like that, there's so many things that they recorded the first album in Morocco in 1959. They were the first band behind the Iron Curtain in 1960 in Russia and Poland, and they taught there. That's before Benny Goodman. Right. So as people read this book, they'll be fascinated to find he played one of the first electric basses made. And I know people that knew my father for years. I said, man, I never knew he played an electric bass. No, he played one of the first ones. It was a new instrument then. There was only like 4 or 5 of them being played publicly at that time and being recorded. And he had one of them. But if we don't write, there's a lot of people. He's just one. There's a lot of people that have not been exposed to the public that should be. Yeah. But the only way that's going to happen, we have to write. We got writers in the jazz community. People got PhD.
Yeah.
They're going to have to write. Even the writers of articles, you're going to have to take on a book assignment.
Yeah.
Like take Freddie Hubbard. I just mentioned him earlier, right? So I ran into Larry Ridley at the Jazz Educators Network conference in Orlando. He's 85. Now, if you want to write a book on Freddie Hubbard, I could name 2 people that grew up with him that's still alive. Both octogenarians, James Spalding and Larry Ridley. If you don't get to them sometime soon, forget it. You might as
Yeah.
well, you damn you should forget doing the book. Because if you don't get that foundational account of how he grew up in Annapolis, Indiana, you're going to be short. And they're here now. So
Yeah.
if you wait 2 or 3 years and they die, and you're gonna be fishing, wishing, and guessing about this man's history. And we have too much of that in jazz writing. Too many people speaking for the musicians that weren't there.
Right.
They weren't there. They don't know. They're
Yeah.
guessing about a lot of stuff. So while we have these cats here, and about 20 people I interviewed for this musician, they're dead. And they
Right.
have valuable information. You
Yeah.
hear what I'm saying to you?
Yeah,
And so
definitely.
I got to them just in time. Buster Smith, who was very essential to the writing of this book, he died 90 days after our last interview. And we started with him in 2003
Wow.
in January. But by July, he was dead the same year. And he had
Wow.
pictures. He remembered what people said, what they were wearing. I mean, details, you know. And so a lot more has to be done. And so I'm trying to do my part as much as I can.
Brilliant. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Wait a minute, we've done already?
Yeah,
Wow.
but I want to talk to you a little bit about the music
Yes.
because this is your tribute, your musical kind of tribute to your dad and to
Yes.
those guys. So where did you start? Did you start with the trumpet? Did you start on the keyboard? How did you start writing this stuff?
It's funny because I got a grant from Montgomery County Arts Council to do this project. And so it was really corporate. I said, well, now I have to write some music. Sometime when you give yourself assignments and deadlines and stuff, it gives you the fuel you need to really get it done. So I just sat down at the piano and said, well, I got to come up with some music. And I started playing with some chords and I came up with this vamp. And that's the vamp you hear on A Soldier Story. And then I wanted a simple theme that you could hum. I wanted the music to have a pop and a kick to it, something you could pat your foot to with a memorable theme. So I put the military style introduction on there and very basic melody that you could hum and remember. And then we just solo and tried to, explore what we could do in that
Right.
time. But I wanted to have that pop and kick because the jazz I heard coming up, man, when you walked in, let me tell you something. That first tune that would kick you out the door. You might have to leave because it might be the fastest, loudest, hardest thing. And these cats would be backstage just, hey, man, who won the game today? Everybody's all calm. But, man, when they hit that bandstand, if the first two might be 100 miles and you just how can you just walk up on a bandstand and just play that fast?
Yeah.
Just off the bat like that. So New York was like that. It was real high intensity kind of music. So I was trying to capture a little of that.
Right.
Duke and the Whirlwind, my father wrote and I talk about it in the book. It's called the Duke of Winds. And so he was sharing a dressing room with Toots Tillman out in California. He showed it to Phineas Newborn, and Phineas left it in the dressing room. And the next thing you know, they heard the song. It was called Bluesette by Toots Tillman. So I wrote this line off the chords of Bluesette. And I called it Duke and the Whirlwind because my father said, man, if I had gotten credit for this tune, it would have changed the whole financial landscape of our lives.
Right.
So that was my effort to steal it back. And so NASA Blues is just a funky kind of trying to get that Memphis kind of feel,
Yeah.
They used to play a certain kind of flavor of the blues that's specific to Memphis. I tried to capture a little of that in NASA Blues. Tropical Breeze was written by my father. I put a little Caribbean intro. It's a kind of a difficult tune to really play that melody and the chords. They do some interesting chord movement, and some interesting intervals in there that make it a challenge to play. Then Caravan, of course, kind of speaks to that same journey concept. And so that we did Cherokee fast because that was another thing. Those guys played fast.
Yeah.
So I wanted to have a tribute to that kind of tempo. You don't hear tempos like that
No.
too often now,
Yeah.
But like I was saying, I was trying to demonstrate what I was telling you earlier about how you would come in You know, sometimes when the first tune people want to warm up, boo-doo, beep, 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 boo-dee-dee-doo-dee-da. So they'll play something real moderate, but those guys never do that. They would play something and be like, and it'd be the first tune. And so their bandstand was a rough one. You know, that's why a lot of people didn't want to get up there and
Right,
play with them because they'll call a tempo like that. And it's either you sink or you swim.
right.
That's it. That's it. You know,
Yeah,
and it's not a lot of time to think and all that kind of stuff. You can forget about that. I mean, when the tempo's like that, there is no thinking. You just gotta lock in and go with it.
yeah,
So each of these tunes, I explained it when the liner notes
yeah.
have a underlying concept and reason for being on the CD. So
Yeah,
that's why I made it a companion to the book, just trying to capture some of those moods and grooves and tempos that I heard those guys play,
that's
particularly with
amazing.
George Coleman, because they stuck together. Those guys, Hal Mayburn, George Coleman, Frank, they came from Memphis to New York, and they still managed to play together. And when they did, they brought all that history with them. That's what made it so powerful. If you ever got a chance to see them to play, and they recorded too. Like I would say, Manhattan Panorama is a good example of what I'm talking about. The tempos, the blues. So
Yeah,
I tried to reflect a little of that kind of vibe in this recording.
brilliant. Fantastic. Oh, honestly, it's been such a pleasure talking to you, Muneer.
Yes.
Really
So
has.
where are the jazz clubs there? Can you walk out your home and go to
Yeah,
a jazz club that's not too far?
yeah. So once a month we have a jazz club in my hometown, and there's some
Wow.
amazing people come up. It's
Wow.
really, really good. And then I
I
get
sure would
down.
like to come there one day.
Oh, you should. You absolutely should. Yeah.
Did I tell you the story? I always tell people that London kidnapped me in 1993. I got stranded there, and I tried, I tried every way I could to get out of there, and I ended up having to stay there for 3 weeks. And so in that time, I met Courtney Pine,
Oh,
I
wow.
met Gary Crosby, I met
Oh.
Trevor Watkins,
Oh.
and we're still friends today. Tony Coffey,
Oh, wow.
Alan Weeks. It was like the who's who of jazz because there was a community there,
Yeah.
and it needs to be. There've been some documentaries, but there needs to be just a book on them because I left the United States and I found the same kind of environment that was here, right there in London with those guys. The jam sessions, they were
Yeah.
listening to music, they were reading the books,
Yeah.
and they were excited and
Yeah.
animated to be involved in the music.
Well, and
So I got a
those
special relationship with London in the UK.
good. Well, you have to come.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
definitely. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and thank you for getting in
Likewise.
touch with me.
Thank you.
This is just wonderful. This is the Jamil Nasser track, Tropical Breeze, played by his son Muneer, who you've just heard that conversation, which was truly extraordinary. I absolutely loved it, and I came off the call and went straight and bought the book. So I'm now reading through it, and it is full, packed, absolutely full of gold nuggets of that story of his father. Do check out the links in the show notes, and thank you for joining me once more for Harmonious World. Enjoy a little bit more of this tropical breeze. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook, and it's a great delight to bring this series of discussions with musicians and composers and writers and all sorts of people to you. Obviously, there's no point in having a podcast if people aren't listening, and I'm very grateful to my listeners for doing so. Thanks also to Joe English for composing and performing this new theme tune. So wherever you get your podcast, you can leave a review. You can share this with your friends and family, either as a link or on social media and that sort of thing. I'd be really grateful for that. Don't forget that you can subscribe now. There's a link wherever you get your podcasts. So have a great week, and please remember why I started this, which is just to try and make the world a little more harmonious. Thanks for listening to Harmonious World.